The moment Gerald Hargrove pointed his finger across the table at my daughter and said, "You will never be one of us," I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than anger. Something quieter. I set down my fork. I folded my napkin. And I looked at the man my daughter had spent 3 years trying to impress. And I thought, you have no idea who you just made an enemy of. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a postal inspector with the federal government. I retired to a modest house in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I raised my daughter alone after her mother passed from ovarian cancer 11 years ago. Just the two of us, Claire and me, in that house on Birchwood Lane, eating frozen dinners on Sunday nights when I was too tired to cook, watching old movies she pretended to hate but actually loved, building a life that was small and ordinary, and, in every way that counted, absolutely full. When Claire met Marcus Hargrove at a conference in Atlanta 4 years ago, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen since she was a little girl opening presents on Christmas morning. That particular kind of light, the kind that makes a father feel grateful and terrified at the same time. She called me from the hotel that night, whispering like she was afraid the walls might hear her. "Dad," she said, "I think I just met someone really special." I was happy for her. I was. The first time I met Marcus, I liked him well enough. He was 34, well-spoken, worked in commercial real estate alongside his father's company. He looked at Claire the way a man should look at a woman he loves, like she was the most interesting person in any room she walked into. I shook his hand and told him to take care of my daughter, and he said, "Yes, sir," without hesitating, and that counted for something. What I did not yet understand was that Marcus was a man who existed in 2 different versions of himself depending on who was watching. Around Claire, around me, he was warm and attentive. Around his father, Gerald Hargrove, he became something else entirely. Smaller, quieter, a boy who had never quite managed to grow up under that particular roof. I should have paid more attention to that. Gerald Hargrove built his real estate empire across 3 states over 4 decades. He started in commercial property development in Charlotte, expanded into Atlanta, then Nashville, and by the time Claire married Marcus 2 years ago, in a ceremony at a vineyard outside Chattanooga, Gerald's company, Hargrove Capital Development, was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 million. I know because Gerald mentioned it at the rehearsal dinner, unprompted, between the salad course and the entree. $400 million, he said, loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear, swirling his wine glass. Not bad for a man who started with nothing. He looked at me when he said it. I was eating a bread roll. I smiled and said, "That's impressive, Gerald." Because it was. I wasn't in a competition with the man. I was there to watch my daughter get married. But that was the night I first understood the kind of person I was dealing with. Gerald Hargrove was the kind of man who needed every room to know his worth, who needed every conversation to circle back to what he had built and what others hadn't. He was civil to me the way you are civil to someone you've already decided doesn't matter, polite in the way that has edges on it. His wife, Beverly, was different. She was quiet and gracious and seemed to carry a private sadness that had been with her so long she no longer noticed its weight. She hugged Claire on the wedding day and whispered something in her ear that made Claire cry happy tears. And whatever Beverly Hargrove's faults were, I never found one worth mentioning. The first year of the marriage was fine. Claire and Marcus lived in a beautiful house in a suburb of Atlanta that Gerald had essentially bought for them, though he called it a loan with terms that changed depending on his mood. Claire called me regularly. She sounded happy, mostly. But there were moments, small ones, where I heard something underneath the happiness that I filed away without examining too closely. A slight hesitation before she answered certain questions, a carefulness around the topic of Gerald that didn't used to be there. In the second year, the calls became less frequent, not dramatically, gradually, the way a light dims when the power is inconsistent. And when we did talk, there was more editing in her voice, more of what she wasn't saying sitting right there between the sentences. I drove down to Atlanta in October of that second year for what was supposed to be a casual weekend visit. When Claire hugged me at the door, I held her for a moment longer than usual, and I noticed she was thinner. Not dangerously so, but noticeably, and there was a tension in her shoulders that didn't release even when she smiled. That Saturday morning, Marcus got a call from Gerald, and whatever was said on that call, by the time Marcus came back to the kitchen, the warmth had gone out of the room. He was short with Claire for the rest of the morning. Not cruel, just absent, like a switch had been thrown. Claire moved carefully around him, adjusting herself to the new temperature in the house, without even appearing to notice she was doing it. I drove home on Sunday evening thinking about what I had seen, and I thought about the 31 years I had spent in federal law enforcement, about the patterns I had learned to recognize in people who were being controlled in ways they weren't fully aware of yet. And I made myself a quiet promise. I was watching, and I was patient. The Christmas dinner invitation came in late November. A formal invitation actually printed and mailed on heavy cardstock with the Hargrove family crest embossed at the top, which was the kind of thing that told you everything you needed to know about Gerald Hargrove. The dinner was to be at the Hargrove estate in Buckhead, the Atlanta neighborhood where old money and new money lived side by side pretending they were the same thing. December 23rd, 6 o'clock, black tie optional. I drove down from Knoxville on the 22nd and stayed at a Hampton Inn because Claire had quietly let me know that Gerald had not extended an invitation to stay at the estate, and she was apologetic about it in a way that broke my heart a little. I told her the hotel was fine. I told her I preferred it. I meant it. The estate was everything you would expect from a man who mailed formal Christmas invitations on embossed cardstock. A Georgian colonial with a circular driveway, professionally decorated with about $14,000 worth of exterior lighting by my rough estimate, and a valet service staffed by young men in matching black jackets who took your keys with the practiced efficiency of people who had been made to practice. There were about 30 guests in total, business associates of Gerald's, a few family members, some neighbors who belonged to the same golf club. I was introduced to several of them over cocktails, and I watched how their faces organized themselves when I mentioned I was retired federal government, and I watched how Gerald's face organized itself when he heard me say that from across the room. A slight tightening, a quick recalculation. I was wearing my best suit, which I had bought 4 years ago for Claire's wedding. It was a good suit. It was not a $4,000 suit. Gerald's was. We sat down to dinner at 7. The table was long and formal, with place cards and 3 different wine glasses per setting, and candles in silver holders that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. I was seated near the far end of the table, away from Gerald and Beverly. Claire was to my left. Marcus was across from her, next to his father. For the first hour, the dinner was perfectly fine. The food was extraordinary. I'll give Gerald's chef that. The conversation around my end of the table was easy and pleasant. The woman to my right was a retired school teacher from Marietta who had been Gerald's neighbor for 15 years and who clearly thought he was a difficult person but was too well-mannered to say so directly. We talked about Tennessee, about her grandchildren, about a novel we had both read. Then the seating arrangement changed. Partway through the main course, Gerald moved. He did it casually, the way powerful people do things, as if the world simply rearranges itself around their preferences, pulling his chair and his wine glass down to our end of the table with the stated reason of wanting to catch up with family. Several guests shifted to accommodate him. He settled himself directly across from Claire and looked at her the way a man looks at something he owns that hasn't been performing to expectations. "You look thin," he said to her, without preamble. Not concerned, appraising. Claire smiled. "Thank you for having us, Gerald. The food is incredible." He waved that away. "Marcus tells me you've been working longer hours. What is it you do again?" "Interior something?" "Interior design," Claire said, and her voice was steady. "I've been growing the business this year. We took on 3 new commercial clients." "Interior design," Gerald repeated, with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's charming." He looked around the table in a way that invited others to share in whatever private amusement he was having. A couple of people smiled reflexively. The retired schoolteacher did not. I set down my wine glass. "Her work is exceptional," I said. "She designed the renovation at the Caldwell Medical Center in Nashville last spring, 30,000 square feet. Gerald looked at me. "Right," he said. "You're the mailman." The table went quiet. Not entirely, there were still other conversations happening at the other end. But at our section, the air changed. Postal inspector, I said. Federal law enforcement. Retired. Of course, Gerald said. Like the distinction was amusing rather than important. He turned back to Claire. My question is really about priorities. Marcus has a lot of responsibilities, Claire. The business is in a significant growth phase. I need him focused. What I'm hearing is that your little decorating business is taking up more of your time than the marriage. My daughter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I saw it because I had been watching her jaw tighten and relax her whole life, and I knew every variation of what it meant. I think Claire and I manage our time together very well, Marcus said from across the table, but his voice had that quality to it, the compliance dressed up as confidence, and he didn't meet his father's eyes when he said it. I'm not talking to you yet, Gerald said to his son, not harshly, dismissively, like turning down the volume on a television. Gerald, Beverly said softly from somewhere down the table. He ignored her. I had a conversation with Marcus last week, Gerald continued, addressing Claire directly, about the next 5 years. The company is expanding into the DC corridor. Marcus is going to need to relocate for a period, possibly 18 months, possibly longer. And I need him there without distractions. Claire looked at him carefully. What does that mean exactly? It means, Gerald said, taking a slow sip of his wine and then setting the glass down with the deliberateness of a man who likes to let silence do his dirty work, that I'm not sure you fit into what Marcus needs to accomplish. I'm not sure you ever have. You're a lovely girl, Claire, but you come from very different circumstances than this family, and I think everyone at this table knows that. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. I looked at my daughter. She was sitting perfectly still, and the expression on her face was one I recognized from when she was 9 years old and the other children at school had been unkind to her, that specific composure that costs everything to maintain. I looked at Marcus. He was staring at his plate. I looked at Gerald Hargrove, who was swirling his wine again with the satisfied expression of a man who had just said out loud what he had been wanting to say for 2 years. I picked up my napkin from my lap and set it on the table next to my plate. Very deliberately. Gerald, I said. He looked at me with mild interest. The way you look at a dog that has started to bark. My daughter, I said, keeping my voice very even, graduated summa cum laude from Georgia Tech. She built her business from $300 and a second-hand laptop at the kitchen table in my house in Knoxville, while she was also caring for a parent who had just lost his wife. She has done nothing in her life except work hard and love your son honestly. And you just insulted her at your dinner table in front of 30 people because she didn't come from money. I paused. I want to make sure I have that right. Gerald's expression didn't change much. If anything, he looked mildly entertained. I didn't insult anyone. I stated facts. Dad, Marcus said, and his voice had a different quality now, not the compliance, something closer to alarm. I'm curious about something, I said to Gerald, and I said it very quietly, the way I used to talk in interviews when I wanted someone to hear exactly what I was saying. In your 4 decades in real estate development, you ever have a postal inspector look at your books? The temperature at the table shifted. Excuse me? Gerald said. I spent 31 years investigating financial fraud, mail fraud, and wire fraud for the federal government, I said. It's an interesting specialty. Most people don't know how much of modern business fraud runs through the postal system, electronic communications too, these days. But the statutes are the same. I picked up my wine glass and held it. Just a general question. No reason. Gerald looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled the kind of smile that's actually a decision being made. I think we've had enough of that particular conversation, he said, and smoothly redirected to the couple to his left, with the practiced ease of a man who had been controlling rooms for 40 years. I stayed at the table. I finished my dinner. I spoke to the retired schoolteacher about her garden. I hugged Claire when the evening ended, and I held her a moment longer than usual, and I said into her ear, "You don't have to tolerate this." She pulled back and looked at me with her mother's eyes and said, "Dad, it's fine." I nodded. I said goodnight to everyone I was supposed to say goodnight to. I shook Gerald's hand at the door and said, "Thank you for a lovely evening," and meant none of it, and drove back to my Hampton Inn, I sat in the hotel room with my jacket off and my tie loosened, and I called a man named Raymond Cho. Raymond Cho had been my supervisor for 11 years at the Postal Inspection Service before he transferred to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. He was 68 now, retired but connected in the way that people who spend 30 years in federal law enforcement are always connected. We talked maybe 4 times a year. We'd fished together in Montana twice. He was the best investigator I had ever known. I said, "Ray, I need a favor. Nothing official, just a set of eyes." He said, "Tell me what you've got." I told him about Gerald. I told him about Hargrove Capital Development. I told him about what 3 decades of professional instinct felt like when it was humming, and how it had been humming all through that dinner. Ray listened the way Ray always listened, without interrupting, without dismissing. "It's probably nothing," I said. "But you don't think it's nothing," Ray said. "No," I said. "I don't. Give me a week," he said. He called me back in 4 days. "I want to explain something about how financial fraud works in large real estate development companies, because what Ray found was specific, and I want you to understand why it mattered. When a company the size of Hargrove Capital Development acquires properties, finances, construction, brings in investors, and operates across multiple states, there are a significant number of communications, contracts, disclosures, investment solicitations that travel through the U.S., mail, and through electronic channels. Federal law is very clear about misrepresentation in those communications. It is a crime. It is a federal crime. And it tends to be a crime that leaves a paper trail that, once you know where to look, is not particularly difficult to follow. What Ray found, with the help of a former colleague who was still active at the FBI's Atlanta field office, was that Hargrove Capital Development had been sending investment solicitation materials to prospective investors that contained financial projections, specifically occupancy rate projections for 3 commercial properties in the D.C. corridor that bore no meaningful relationship to the actual data the company's own internal analysts had prepared. The real projections showed vacancy rates of nearly 40%. The solicitation materials shown to investors projected 12%. The difference between those two numbers represented approximately $22 million in investment capital that had come in over the past 18 months from individuals who had been, by any reasonable legal standard, misled. $22 million. And that was only the portion Ray's contact had managed to confirm in 4 days. "There's more," Ray told me. "The DC expansion is heavily leveraged against properties in Atlanta that the company has been overvaluing in its own filings. I've seen this pattern before. It unravels fast once the regulators start pulling the thread." "How serious?" I asked. "Mail fraud, wire fraud, securities fraud, if the investor materials qualify, federal charges, the kind that don't go away with good lawyers." He paused. "You want me to pass this to my contact?" I thought about Claire. I thought about what she looked like sitting perfectly still at that table while a man told her she didn't fit. I thought about Marcus staring at his plate. "Yes," I said. "Understood," Ray said. "Consider it done. I want to be clear about something. I did not fabricate anything. I did not plant anything. I did not call in a personal favor to create a false case against a man because he had been rude to my daughter. What I did was make a phone call to a person with the expertise and authority to look at something that my 31 years of professional experience told me deserved looking at. What the FBI found, they found because it was there to find. Gerald Hargrove had been committing federal fraud. He had been doing it for at least 2 years. He would have continued doing it whether I made that call or not. The only thing I changed was the timing. I drove back to Knoxville on Christmas Eve. I didn't tell Claire. Not yet. I wrapped the small gifts I'd bought for her. I called my brother in Ohio. I ate leftover Chinese food at my kitchen table and watched the snow fall on Birchwood Lane, and I let things move at the speed they move when federal investigators start pulling threads. It took 6 weeks. On the first Thursday of February, Gerald Hargrove was arrested at his office in Buckhead by agents from the FBI's Atlanta field office. The charges included 2 counts of mail fraud, 3 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of securities fraud related to the investment solicitation materials. His CFO was arrested the same morning at a property site in Bethesda. Two of his senior attorneys received target letters indicating they were also under investigation. By noon, it was on the local Atlanta news. By evening, it was in the Wall Street Journal. I found out because Claire called me. She was at her own house, her and Marcus's house, and her voice was shaking slightly, but not in the way I was afraid it might be. In the way that happens when the ground under something has been shifting for a long time and then finally, definitively, shifts all the way. "Dad," she said, "did you know about this?" I paused for only a moment. "I made a phone call," I said, "to someone who knew people who needed to know what was apparently there to know." There was a long silence. "Oh, Dad," she said. "I didn't invent anything," I said. "I just pointed." She was quiet for a moment more. Then she said, He didn't know. He genuinely didn't know." "I believe that," I said, because I did. Marcus was a man who had spent his life not looking too closely at the things his father did, which was its own kind of failure, but it was not fraud. "He's devastated," she said. "I know. He called his dad this morning, and his dad told him that if he cooperates with the investigation, he's no longer his son." I closed my eyes. "What did Marcus say?" I asked. "He said, 'Then I guess I'm no longer your son.'" Her voice broke a little when she said it. "Dad, I think Marcus might actually be okay. I think he might be better, now that this is—" She stopped. "Is that a terrible thing to say?" "No," I said, "it's not." Gerald Hargrove's trial lasted 11 days the following autumn. I did not attend. I had given my information to the investigators and let the process do what the process does. I had no interest in being present for Gerald's humiliation. That had never been the point. He was convicted on all 6 counts. The sentencing was scheduled for January. Marcus had been, as Claire had suggested, better. Not immediately. The months between the arrest and the trial were genuinely hard, and I won't pretend otherwise. The Hargrove Company's assets were frozen pending investigation, which meant the house Gerald had loaned them was suddenly in a complicated legal situation. Marcus left the company the week after the arrest and started from scratch, doing independent real estate consulting. He worked 12-hour days. He was, for the first time in his adult life, entirely unsupported by his father's infrastructure, and whatever that cost him in security, it seemed to be returning something to him that had been diminished for a long time. He called me in June. I was surprised by the call. We had never spoken on the phone, just the two of us. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't," I said. "At Christmas dinner," he said. "When my father talked to Claire that way, I should have." "Marcus," I said, "I should have." "You're doing it now," I said. "That counts." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for not hating me." I told him I had never hated him. I told him I had been afraid for my daughter, and that was different from hating the person beside her. He asked if I would come down to Atlanta in the fall. He and Claire had moved into a smaller house, one that was entirely their own, no family loans attached, in a neighborhood near Decatur that I had never been to. He said Claire had been redesigning the whole interior, and it looked, in his words, like something out of a magazine, and he said it with a pride that I had not heard in his voice before when he talked about her work. I said yes. Gerald was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. His CFO received 7. The 2 attorneys under investigation reached plea agreements. The investors who had been misled were part of a civil recovery process that was expected to take years to fully resolve, but the attorneys handling it were confident about the outcome. Beverly Hargrove moved to a smaller home in Charlotte, near her sister. I heard through Claire that she had seemed, in the months since the arrest, genuinely lighter, as if something heavy had been removed from a room she had been living in for 40 years. I hope that's true. I hope she's planting things in a garden somewhere and sleeping through the night. I went to Atlanta in October, the way I said I would. I drove down on a Friday and arrived in the late afternoon when the light was doing that particular thing it does in the South in autumn, all gold and amber and slightly heartbreaking. The new house was small and warm and smelled like the candles. Claire always burned something with cedar in it, which she got from her mother. The renovation she had done was beautiful. I walked through each room and she explained the choices, the colors, the light sources, the way she had reclaimed the original hardwood floors. And I listened the way I used to listen when she was 10 years old, and explaining something she was proud of, which is to say completely, without reservation, because there is nothing in this world I am more interested in than the things my daughter cares about. We ate dinner at their kitchen table, the three of us, and Marcus made a pasta from a recipe he had apparently been teaching himself since the spring, and it was genuinely excellent. And I told him so, and he looked pleased in a way that was uncomplicated. After dinner, Claire and I sat on the back porch while Marcus cleaned up inside. The neighborhood was quiet. Someone a few houses down was playing music softly. The air was cool enough for a jacket. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said. "Always." "That night at Christmas, when you said what you said to Gerald about the postal inspectors and the books," she paused. "You already knew something was wrong, didn't you? Or suspected?" "I suspected," I said. "I had nothing concrete, but something. A feeling," I said. 31 years of a feeling. She was quiet for a moment. "He really thought you were just a mailman." "Most people do," I said. I never minded. She laughed, and it was her real laugh, the one she has had since she was a child, uninhibited and slightly loud, and I had not heard it sound that uncomplicated in a long time. I let it fill up the porch and the quiet neighborhood around it, and I kept it somewhere I keep things I want to remember. "Dad," she said after a while, "were you scared? At the dinner? When you said those things to him?" I thought about that honestly. "No," I said. "The only time I was scared was in the parking lot afterward, when I was sitting in the car and I thought about what you looked like when he was talking to you. That scared me. I looked at the yard, not Gerald. You." She reached over and took my hand the way she used to, when she was very small, just wrapped her fingers around mine without saying anything, and we sat there for a while, listening to the music from down the street. I thought about what it means to protect someone. I had spent 31 years in the business of protection in a legal and institutional sense, investigating crimes, building cases, making the mechanisms of justice work the way they were supposed to work. And that is important work. I believed in it, and I still do. But the thing that had gotten me out of that chair at Gerald Hargrove's Christmas dinner table was not 31 years of professional experience. It was the memory of a 9-year-old girl sitting at the kitchen table on Birchwood Lane, doing homework with her tongue slightly between her teeth, the way she always did when she was concentrating, in the house where we had learned to be a family of 2 after the world took the third of us away, in the life we had built out of what we had, which was ordinary and small, and entirely enough. That was what I was protecting. Not my pride, not my dignity, though I would not apologize for that either. Not the satisfaction of seeing a powerful man humbled, though I won't pretend it didn't feel, in some deep and honest part of me, entirely appropriate. I was protecting the right of my daughter to sit at any table in the world and take up exactly as much space as she deserves. Which is a great deal. Which is more than Gerald Hargrove, in 9 years or 900 years, will ever fully understand. Some men build empires. $400 million in embossed cardstock and valets in matching jackets, and a name that means something in 3 states. I raised a daughter. I know which one I'm prouder of. The music down the street had stopped. The neighborhood was quiet. Marcus had turned off the kitchen light, and I could see, through the back door, that he had made coffee and left 2 mugs on the counter for us, which was a small thing and, in its own way, everything. "Cold?" I asked Claire. "A little," she said, and didn't move. Neither did I. We sat there a while longer, in the good dark, in the quiet of a life that had found its way back to something true, and I thought this is what I fought for. Not the verdict, not the 9 years, not any of it. This, right here, this was always the whole point.